My name is Adam Golov, Marketing and Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers, so please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we will make them available on our website. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. Next slide, please. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. Next slide, please. DCL serves a broad client base. Next slide, please. Spanning all industries. Next slide, please. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Keith Schengili-Roberts, Senior Content Strategist, Yellow Pencil, and Phil Neer, User Experience Designer, Yellow Pencil. Keith is the Senior Content Strategist at Yellow Pencil and an award-winning lecturer on information architecture at the University of Toronto's iSchool. Formerly the Manager of Documentation and Localization at Advanced Micro Devices, he now works for Yellow Pencil, aiding their clients with their web deployments, structured content, and DITA XML training and consultation. He also runs the popular industry blog DITA Writer that has become a focal point on DITA practices and software tools. He is the author of 4 technical books on web technologies and lives in Toronto with his wife and 2 daughters. Phil has more than 10 years of experience in communication design, branding, responsive web design, HTML5, CSS3, and jQuery. He's tackled web problems of all shapes and sizes for clients all over the world. He knows the secrets of the mobile web, and he knows how to use them. Phil is a design geek with a passion for creating interesting, fun, usable things that solve real problems. Without further ado, welcome Keith and Phil.
Hello everyone, I'm Keith.
I'm Phil.
And as you can see here, I am the DITA guy.
And I'm the responsive guy.
Yeah. And that's a little bit about who we are. We should probably talk about, what Yellow Pencil is. As it says here, we're a design agency that focuses on content first, primarily responsive design web projects. We also tend to work with large enterprise CMSs that drive large sites and try to solve large, messy, complex content and usability issues. And the types of ECMSs that we tend to work with include the likes of Oracle, Drupal, OpenText, Sitecore, and a few others that you're probably familiar with. What that really means, of course, is that in a nutshell, we make clients that have big, messy web problems, of which there are many, better communicating on the web. And some of our clients that you may be familiar with include Fiserv, BC Transit, the City of Surrey, CPA Canada. We actually have a sort of a specialization looking after municipal websites, city-related websites, transportation and transit. Phil, do you want to speak to some of the other sectors that we've targeted?
Those are sort of our key ones. Some of the other issues areas we deal with are post-secondary education and professional associations.
Perfect. So I want to tell you a little tale, short story about going back to my roots, basically. Maybe just click again, Phil. There we are. That's my Darwin beard and mustache coming online. One of the questions I certainly got asked at the DITA conference in Seattle was basically, what's a nice DITA IA/consultant doing becoming a web content strategist? And part of the reason was realizing that many of the types of problems facing typical website development and design are common to most tech docs. And in point of fact, essentially web is where I started from. And as evidence of that, I want to show you a picture of my very first website. Isn't it a thing of beauty? Okay, maybe not. Yeah, it is actually from pretty much the dinosaur era of the web. This actually dates back to, believe it or not, circa 1995. The date there is actually from a year later, but that's the earliest screenshot I could snag from the Wayback Machine. And you have to understand that this dates back to the very first year or so that commercial interests were allowed to have websites available on the internet. And you have to understand that this this design was still prior to any sort of cascading style sheets, even before table layouts. This is also the era of Netscape version 1, so even before the browser wars of the late 90s. Having said that, my work in this was actually not so much, thankfully, on the graphic design. I really had very little to do with the look of this, thankfully, and actually started out at Delrina. Anybody remember WinFax and the days of fax-based communications by computer? Yeah, I have hard times remembering that as well. But anyways, I started out there first as a technical writer. That was actually where I first cut my teeth many, many years ago. And then because I was working on a web-related product that Delrina was creating at the time, I got to learn dangerous amounts of HTML. And with that, they basically made me a webmaster. Over the years, I've kind of evolved from these early days, going through a bunch of different websites, working on the very initial unified semantic website, bringing together all the various disparate parts from the various divisions and putting together the very first version of the semantic website, and then moving on to some other firms. And then evolving over time from webmaster to information architect, grappling with issues relating to transforming website and website content. It's always been about adding structure to content, focusing on the needs of users, and always trying to be an advocate on behalf of the end user, so that the type of information that users actually truly and really need is what's actually delivered on the web page. And if that statement doesn't sound familiar to many a technical writer out there, then well, there's something wrong. Now, I'd like to show you the most recent website that I helped launch, and well, as you can see, things have changed, hopefully for the better. And I think this also shows that perhaps I've learned a few things over the years. I certainly hope so. This is actually the Western Livestock Price Information Program website. This is basically trying to, well, this is all about selling insurance to cattlemen in the prairie provinces of Canada. So that's Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and I believe BC, if I remember right. So four main provinces out west. And the intent of this is essentially trying to provide information to cattle ranchers on you know, whether it's worth their while to insure their livestock, and you know, make sure that they can get a fix-in on the price level for their heads of cattle prior to it going on sale. And the thing is that with price fluctuations, with currency fluctuations and so forth, this is essentially an insurance program that if things actually end up being slightly cheaper, then you know, they can actually go and you know, and insure against the amount that they would like to have for their cattle head. Now, having said all that, most of the issues that I dealt with in helping put this site together were actually structural in context. So now, having said that, most of the information here is not necessarily structured from, say, a DITA XML standpoint. So this is not actually looking at, strictly speaking, structured from you know, in the capital S structured standpoint. But essentially, the critical thing to know is that the same information architecture processes are put to work here as they are for technical documentation. So essentially what I learned in the tech docs realm, I've applied to website development, and it's done me in good stead. the focus is, and it always should be, on the customer, focusing on what information they need and when and where they need it. So then moving on, and this is basically what Yellow Pencil specializes in. So this is one of the other things that really appealed to me. This is, clearly the way web development is going, and Yellow Pencil has expertise in this area. The challenges may seem to be different between the web and technical docs, but the issues that they face are, I would argue, fundamentally the same. Ideally, they both want to focus on the user and getting them the information that they need, giving information to the user not only what they need, but where and when they need it, and also good web content, much like good DITA-based content, ought to be chunked properly into bite-sized pieces for easy digestion by readers.
And so my story is in some ways similar to Keith. I too am a dinosaur, but probably more of a triceratops to Keith's Stegosaurus. I've been working on the web since the late 90s, learned to code HTML, and have sort of moved from HTML to graphic design to UX and interaction design. And over the time, sort of seen different ways and different approaches to building out, especially content-heavy and complex sites. And the more I got to talking to Keith, because we all of a sudden had this IA tech doc background guy who was talking about DITA, and the more he talked about this, the more it started to come together that it's really the same process with a different technological underpinning. I worked on learning projects that were XML-based, very similar, and the more we work with large-scale CMS projects, the more we realize that the chunking approach and the structured content approach is the key piece that makes responsive really effective. And that's sort of been the genesis for this talk, and sort of brought us together on how responsive and DITA really are in some ways made for each other. Keith?
Yeah, so essentially what we're trying to say is that the web these days, you shouldn't think of it as just being desktop centric, because these days, and if you go to the next slide, essentially there, as I'm sure people are well aware, there's a variety of platforms and devices with differing resolutions and screen sizes. So this is what we're pretty much all familiar with at the moment. You can see here standard desktop systems, tablets, notebooks, and of course smartphones and various other tablet-like devices. It's worth noting that because of the advent of the mobile web, Windows is actually no longer the dominant operating system that's actually used to surf the web. And in fact, if you want to look at more information on that, I highly recommend Mary Meeker's Internet Trends report for this year, which came out, I think, just a few weeks ago. And in that report, it's worth noting that in this year she mentioned that tablet sales actually managed to outstrip desktop PCs and notebook sales back in 2012. So that brings us to this point, because this is where the web is actually going. So not just the devices that we're already familiar with, but potentially things like, well, surf the web, look up things, on your fridge. One of my inkjet printers does have a small web-like interface on it. We're seeing more devices coming online for things like wrist wearables that also have some limited web functionality, and things like gaming consoles, and of course also things like Google Glass. And at this point, I'm going to pass things over to Phil, because I think there's a picture we want to show you here.
I actually don't. I'll have to add that at send a link out to that. But while we were at the DITA conference in Seattle, we actually got to do some test runs of Google Glass, and as far as responsive goes, it's just another Android browser. So that was great to see that that no matter how technology changes, responsive as an approach seems to at least be the more future-friendly than some of the other approaches.
Very cool. Yeah. So what's worth noting is that for the majority of people out there, now I realize this is a Canadian stat, but bear with me for a moment. Essentially, the web comes first. The mobile web essentially is well, initially it is the web when people are looking for information about how to pretty much do anything. If they're looking up information, the web is essentially their first choice. Now, this, as I say, is kind of Canuck-centric, but we are aware that there are comparable numbers that apply to the folks in the U.S. This information, by the way, came from the Institute for Citizen-Centered Services from 2013. The primary drivers of service satisfaction overall are things like timeliness, ease of use, ease of access, and the positive outcome. So being able to complete a transaction through a single channel is a primary means to delivering customer satisfaction. And this same study found that only 38% of participants could complete their transactions using a single channel, which means, that brings us to this slide, which is we're now really at the tipping point, because basically half of all smartphone users primarily use their phone not as a phone, but to use it to access the internet. And this result actually comes from a report by supermonitoring.com. What this really says is that, and this will come as no surprise to people here, people are using mobile. They don't just use it as a stopgap until they get to their desktop. It's often their first choice. If they're commuting on the bus, if they're looking up a fact while at a restaurant, talking to friends, where do they go? They don't wait till they get home. They'll check it out immediately on their phones. Now, the other thing is that the other interesting thing that came out of this, out of a related study, is that it's also been found that 90% of consumers who own more than one device will use multiple devices to accomplish a goal. And now, what does that actually mean? That it essentially means that people will often start things like doing a search on their desktop for a particular item or for information. And when they're actually out in the field, when they're looking to actually apply this, or perhaps buy products, or some other, some sort of information gathering going on, they will actually transfer the search from one device to the other. So this speaks to wanting to keep the information delivery as consistent as possible. You don't want to, shock the user, so to speak, who are coming to your website and then having them go to a completely different experience when they're going to something like, say, mobile. And by the way, this particular stat is actually from Google, from looking at the multi-screen world from a report from 2012. So now I want to talk a little bit about a rather interesting study that Joanne Hackos, she delivered a rather interesting presentation back, I think it was in January, and I did, by the way, I have asked permissions for these to use these particular slides, looking at information development trends. And this was a survey that was sent out to a number of technical publication groups around the world, and this was looking. This particular slide shows, how people are publishing their particular content today, looking at things like print, PDF, HTML, embedded assistance, mobile apps, mobile devices, YouTube, Wiki, and learning management. Now, in the next slide, the question after that was, how do you plan to publish your content in 2 to 3 years' time? Now, in this case, I've actually added some nice little arrows here so you can see the trends. So the interesting thing here is that what's going down? Print and PDF. And as Joanne noted in the original presentation, this is the first time that anybody has predicted that they will be doing less in terms of actual PDF outputs. So way too soon to say, to sound the death knell for PDFs. Far from it. But what's interesting is that people are definitely looking at delivering less of these over the years. And again, it's because, at least in part, this is no longer the output of choice for all devices. It looks and works great on the desktop, but let's face it, it can be kind of a pain if you're trying to load it up on a mobile device. The other interesting aspect of this is that there's clearly a strong desire to publish not only more content in HTML, but also to provide services, more embedded user assistant, more mobile apps, and also to things like other mobile devices. And at least for those categories, okay, maybe not so much for YouTube or perhaps for Wiki or learning management, but we think that responsive web design is actually a way of being able to meet all of those HTML assistants, mobile apps, and ebook Kindle devices all at one go.
So I hope that by this point we've sort of made the case that mobile is happening, and you're going to have to sort of be prepared for a web environment that includes more than desktop. So we've talked about responsive a bit as our approach to dealing with this. So what exactly is responsive? It's probably a buzzword you've heard a bunch of. There's a lot of official technical definitions. This is the one I like to use because it's sort of the most high level and easiest to understand. That responsive is basically uses a single set of code to deliver a cohesive experience no matter what their connection or screen size. That's a nice thing, but how does that actually work? It's basically a combination of media queries, which are, everyone probably knows if you've done any web work over the last sort of 15 years. The initial media query was the print style sheet. It's basically just a little if statement in your CSS file that used to say, if print, use these styles. At this point, there's a lot more flexibility in it, and you can check for screen width, resolution. Is it a high density display or not? Is it portrait versus landscape? What's the height of the screen or height of the browser window? And based on those metrics, you can set different CSS rules that change the layout. So basically, media queries and CSS lead to fluid layouts that are customized or adjust for various screen sizes. Flexible layouts are something that we've had for a long time, back when they used to be table-based, and they were flexible. They were just horrible if you got outside of that general sort of mid-width comfort zone. And the beauty in the media query approach is that as things get larger, you can just reposition things. You can also, one of the big keys is there's now a way to have images that resize flexibly. Used to be that images were a fixed size, and that was that, and you're pretty much stuck with them. So now with images that can scale flexibly and layouts that can scale flexibly, you can then start building screens that will adjust. And the standard pattern is that things will stack. As you can see, there's sort of 2 paragraph examples of how a layout changes based on width. It's the same layout, but on a smaller screen, we just have a smaller image and a slightly tighter column. There's lots of things to consider when you're designing responsive sites and in general sites that need to adapt to multiple screen sizes. And one of the key things is ensuring you've got the appropriate type of navigation. There's a number of different navigation patterns that are being tested out and sort of establishing themselves. These are all sort of ways of taking your standard navigation bar, from the desktop size and making it available in some way that makes sense to mobile users. And one of the most common patterns that's sort of coming about is the off-canvas pattern that's come from sort of an app design side. And it basically has your list of links, your main navigation sort of off screen, and you tap the menu button and it'll slide in from the left or the right or the top, or if you've got a more complex site, maybe you've got multiple off-canvas patterns. But there's another lots of other patterns depending on the size and scope of your navigation. You could have an expanding list. You could just have a list that collapses down and stacks if you've got 2 or 3 items. There's patterns that involve just a button that takes you to the bottom of the page, and you've got your full navigation listed at the bottom. So there's not one solution that sort of meets everyone's needs. It's basically a question of your site structure. How large is your navigation? How deep is it? How do you expect users to interact with it? And trying to determine what is the best navigation pattern for your current site. And we'll get into this in a little more detail, and I'll show some of these in action during the demo portion towards the end. One of the trickiest things to deal with are responsive tables. Tables have always had that problem that when they get to a certain size, they don't get smaller. And there's no real easy way of making that happen using only CSS. But there's lots of interesting ways that people are trying to refactor tables to allow them to be used in to make them more usable for small screen. There's cases where you could just make using JavaScript and CSS, a combination of JavaScript and CSS, you can do things like make the entire table container scroll. So then you can scroll your table both horizontally and vertically. There's approaches that basically refactor the table on the fly, so that basically as an author you determine what the 3 core columns are, and at the smallest size those get displayed, and then users can select a menu and choose to see other tables. There's also a pattern that flips tables, so that rather than being sort of a large horizontal table, the headers become a column that's fixed on the left and the rest of the table scrolls. So there's different ways you can stack and manipulate data using JavaScript to create a more effective design patterns for mobile devices. One of the benefits or additional benefits of responsive is that it's cross-browser supported, with the caveat of IE9 and newer. And seeing as today I just saw that the New York Times is telling IE8 users that they no longer support IE8, I think we're getting to a technological state where responsive will pretty much work for all organizations. It works on most mobile phones, but as with everything, there's caveats and ways around it. So there's JavaScript frameworks and other methods for trying to get responsive to work in older browsers, and trying to sort of deal with all of the complexity of having multi-browsers in multi-devices. But what are the benefits? So as we see it, the benefits of responsive web design are that it reduces your long-term costs compared to other approaches of dealing with mobile devices, because it's one code base. You don't have to edit and manage an app stack. You don't have to worry about building an app for Android and iOS and maybe BlackBerry or Windows, or depending on what your core markets are. It also streamlines the authoring and content management piece. You only need to edit one set of content. You don't have to worry about editing multiple things in multiple places, content being out of sync with each other. And because it's so widely accessible to multiple devices, you've got it's easier to reach a wider audience, and there's no barriers in the responsive approach to dealing with accessibility. It's just a case of making sure that you design things well. But the key piece to responsive is in all reality, it's a fairly simple approach. You decide which content is most important, and you sort of prioritize content for different screen sizes. It's not necessarily easy. There's lots of little tricks and techniques and scenarios where you have to sort of make choices and weigh the benefits and costs of how things work on both desktop and mobile. You've got to sort of consider bandwidth as well as screen size. So there's more constraints you have to take care of now, and in some ways it sort of takes us back sort of 10 years to a time that not everyone had high-speed connections, and you had to consider image size and what was appropriate for people on a 28K modem. So it's not difficult, but it's also not easy.
Now, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, then now bringing things back to the realm of DITA. I mean, what we're arguing for is that we think that there is an ideal opportunity here for responsive web design and DITA to actually work together. It's not. It's far from impossible to create very good responsive web design based technical docs that is ultimately based on DITA content. We would argue that, in fact, many of the things that make DITA what it is and its strengths actually play into the best of the best ways of delivering content in a responsive web design framework. In terms of how this is actually done, it's a matter of making sure that you create a tailored responsive web design framework and templates that meets the needs of your audience. So you have to know who your audience is and how they're likely accessing your content, and then generate the actual HTML as part of your current workflow. So that might just be part of say a DITA open toolkit output for HTML. You just have a customization there that puts the files into a responsive web design framework, or whatever other sort of output tool you're actually using. But in the end, the key thing here is really trying to get the information architecture right. It's not about getting any old responsive web design template, which are out there, and hoping it works, because, well, it probably won't. I certainly have seen examples, and it's not always pretty. It really does need to be engineered to fit the needs of your users if you want to do it properly. Now, having said that, as any good IA knows, you have to understand and design for your users and their particular priorities. Now, one thing that we've witnessed over the past few years is a general movement in the tech docs world away from very large doc sets to smaller, more focused docs. Why present like a technical Bible, so to speak, that is several hundred pages long that nobody reads, when you can actually just provide just the bits and pieces out of it for individual customers and audiences that and they will read it and find it of some use. The other things that go hand in hand with producing content that people will use has been not just XML, but also properly structuring the content, and also using minimalist writing techniques to cut away the dross that has been associated with overexpansive tech docs over the years, and getting, distilling things down to its essence. And again, what works really well in a responsive website design framework are these particular things: minimalism and structured content. Perfect, because you may have a limited amount of screen space available on a mobile device to deliver your message, and the best aspects of DITA emphasize exactly that, trying to get your message out in as small a space as possible, but making sure that it's properly directed at the user. So the other thing that we've also seen more recently is docs that are focusing more on the situational needs of the users. So there's more emphasis these days on delivering docs on the go, so to speak. And you know, even there are, for example, some things that I've run across where you know, they want to have your geolocation so that it gets a sense as to where you are, so it can provide you the proper instructions for working with a device that are applicable to your particular area, and then delivering that dynamically. And as we saw earlier, the web is really the very first place that people tend to go to. So now we want to have a quick look at responsive web design in action, and specifically, you know, looking at the information architecture aspects of it. So on the next slide, I want to show you the idea of actually structuring, and I've had that in air quotes here, structuring content. So this is actually the sitemap I drafted for the Western Livestock Insurance Program, and this was looking at you know, what they had in the way of content on their existing website before they asked to come and remodel it for them in a responsive web design framework. Now, this is not XML, this is not DITA, but as you see in the after portion, which you see here, the color is actually representing content which is, in some cases, could be reused one for one in different sections of the website. And they actually, the different portions you see displayed here, we're looking at different insurance programs that were available, but with slight differences. So one might be for relating to mature heads of cattle. Another one might be for calves and yearlings. And then there was another program entirely based on hog production. But there were, you know, it's insurance, so a lot of the stuff actually ended up being the same. Now, what you see on the left side is that all of this information was scattered all over the place. So the content audit that was actually done, and this is again not so different from what a good IA would do on, you know, when restructuring content for, say, a DITA-based documentation project, is going in, finding the similarities, and saying, okay, use these bits and pieces, and we can, you know, reuse them accordingly, and then strip them down to their essentials. And as you can, and you may not be able to tell this from looking at these two images, but the one on the right actually contains far fewer pages in total than the one on the left. And in fact, the one on the left, now I don't know how many people here are familiar with reading sitemaps, website maps, but I'd like to sort of point out the second and third column, which is actually under an area called risk management. If I remember right, there's about 21 separate individual main web pages under that, and this was all put together into a tighter framework that was much easier for people using the site to come in and discover. And actually, you know, having a look at the actual stats after the fact, we actually did find that, you know, more people were actually accessing the content than they were before in the old structure. So there are other benefits to properly, you know, doing IA on a website. Now, moving on to the next slide, there's also the idea about, you know, as I mentioned in the previous slide, looking at, you know, properly structuring the content, because, you know, really good content ought to be concise, and, you know, where possible it should be reused and, you know, structured wherever possible. So in this one case here, we have a cattle-fed glossary web page, and then we have a cattle feeder glossary, and there are different types of insurance. And because the content was essentially the same between the two of them, we had a it wasn't a topic, but it was a topic-like structure, essentially. And it was essentially sharing the same information and mirrored in such a way, in this case using the Drupal CMS, so that a change to one chunk of content would be reflected in the other. So a change in one place would be reflected everywhere. And again, anybody who's used DITA will be very familiar with that process. Now, you might also be wondering, and go to the next slide, you might also be, you know, wondering, now I've been talking about this particular website a lot, you're probably, you know, thinking, do cattlemen really, you know, need mobile? I mean, you know, aren't they out on the farm, and wouldn't they be more likely to, you know, come in at the end of the day and, you know, do things on their desktop computer? But in point of fact, you know, they use mobile just as much as anybody else, if not more so. wireless broadband services is being increasingly delivered to rural communities, and there's really very few scenarios where broadband wireless is not the norm. Certainly within rural America and also within, say, the prairie provinces of Canada. And here's some samples of some articles I ran in class. I love the one about, the rise of smartphones in agriculture. I seem to remember running across an ad for a brand new type of tractor which had various display screens, and one of them actually touted the fact that it had web access. So if you had wireless, while you're actually plowing the field, or hopefully you're not surfing the web and plowing, because that's kind of like surfing the web and driving. Not a good idea, but these things in fact are available to people out in the field. Now, one of the other key things that comes about with responsive web design is looking at the idea of content priority. And this is one of the chief failings of sort of typical standalone templates that you may find out there. So here we have a rough outline of a website's main page, and we have in this case a call to action that's listed in the top right-hand corner. Now, when it's actually displayed on a mobile phone, as you see in the middle portion, the content elements have not been prioritized. In other words, we haven't said, yes, this is really important, so that particular call to action is lost. Now, in terms of the tech docs, think of this as perhaps something like, say, well, related links, for example, in the DITA context, or perhaps something like a table of contents. If people can't find related links or a table of contents, they get lost, and they may not be able to find it so easily. So you need to think about where you want to put this type of information. So in the next version of this, you'll see that, here we are. We've prioritized this particular block, and we want it to always appear at or near the top. In this case, it's now the call to action. It's still there. It remains priority number 1. So then, we want to get down to looking at some actual examples, and I just want to talk about, what you then need to consider. If you just go to the next slide, and it looks at, you need to think about things like, what is the current quality of your content? You cannot just, go and, add responsive web design to your existing content if it's not been properly optimized for it. And again, this is why we think doing things using DITA makes a lot of sense, because using a minimalist writing approach, cutting things down to its essence, topic-based approach, it really goes hand in hand with good responsive web design. You also need to think about, properly designing for the user experience and your CMS's build efficiency. Then we also need to think about, is the content well written and focused squarely on the user's needs? Because if you're looking at a mobile environment, if they can't find what they're looking for in a mobile phone, they'll just go elsewhere. You also need to think in terms of reusable chunks, and this is where, proper IAs need to think about content modeling. Who's the information for? What are the scenarios that they're likely to face? This is doing proper persona and scenario design for technical docs. You also need to think in terms of prioritization, in terms of what is actually displayed on the screen, as we saw with the previous example. And over to you, Phil.
So part of the piece that you need to look at with responsive is trying to figure out how to create a user-centered design. And we generally start with a mobile-first and progressive enhancement approach, where we take the small screen as our starting point, which allows us to have more focused discussions. It's much easier to talk to stakeholders and clients and set priorities when you've only got a small screen to begin with, rather than sort of starting with the desktop screen and all the possibilities that brings with it. Where people can sort of keep envisioning, well, we could have a box and another call out and another thing here. If you start small, you can basically really just get to the absolute nitty-gritty of what needs to be on screen first. And then you can also start with the bare bones from a technical standpoint. Would the site theoretically work on a browser without JavaScript and no images? And then just build up and make sure that as you add new functionality based on browsers, you're not skipping out on functionality for browsers with less capabilities. And this approach also makes dealing with accessibility easier because you're not making assumptions around technology and imagery, and you can really focus on the things that need to be there right from the get-go. So UX
so this is where essentially content and UX really, we think, go hand in hand.
And structured
Phil,
content
sorry.
and DITA, right? Structured content for CMS or structured content in the form of DITA, basically it doesn't really matter. It's designing and structuring content well and delivering it in the most appropriate way for users.
Exactly, and you know, keep in mind that responsive is you know, really not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's really at its core philosophy that includes, you know, many other aspects. You really need to use the right approach for the right reasons. So let's have a look now at some examples of how DITA and responsive web design can actually work together. So this is where DITA meets responsive web design. Now here is an example that we think that pretty much everybody out who's watching this, at least we hope, are familiar with. This is one of the, admittedly at this point, kind of ancient examples going way back to the DITA 1.0 era. In the DITA Open Toolkit, and this, you know, if you're looking to learn the absolute basics of DITA, you know, this code is available in every shipped version of the DITA OT. But what you're going to see now is Phil's responsive web design magic applied to this particular example.
So as Keith mentioned, the link is available to anyone to have a look at, so feel free to check it out. So basically, the idea here was to take content that everyone or most people should be familiar with and just highlight how you can apply a responsive design process and approach and build out a site based on really simple structured content that is usable across multiple devices. So I've started with the basic landing page. It's pretty much the same as was on the demo. I've just added sort of a welcome chunk of text, make it a little friendlier than just having the menu. But you've got basically a structured menu. This is what it looks like. It's sort of a desktop size. At a tablet size, we've just basically realigned the two content paragraphs. And then when you get down to small screen size, we've got the menu comes first, and then you've got the content. You are basically, at this point, you have a responsive site. But it's not necessarily the best way of doing things. So here we have pretty much the same site, but we've added a different pattern for mobile. And in this case, we've just stuck the menu underneath the content and given a quick link to the bottom of the page. It works. There's no reason why you couldn't use this approach depending on how your site's structured. But again, I think we can do better than this. So now we've taken the desktop menu and made that a little different. So now it's an accordion menu. You don't see the whole thing at once, but you've got a better sense if you've got a larger navigation that might be a more usable pattern. And then when you get to following the same pattern for sort of the tablet size, and then at small size, we've just put that up top, and now you can see there's a menu with a small menu that's probably a good place to put it, and you can see that there's content. And now we'll just keep sort of building this up and looking at other things. So this time we've got a desktop menu that has drop-downs. There's no reason it has to be in the page. We can build this thing dynamically, so let's make it more usable for desktop. And at the same time, we've pulled in a call to action. This could be any type. Right now it's just a link to the OTA, but it's just a site that's much more sort of in line with desktop sites that you see. We've got everything sort of set up for the tablet side, and then when it comes to mobile, you've got the call to action underneath, maybe not ideal, and we've got an off-canvas navigation pattern. So this is a great way of sort of storing large navigation. You can expand, you could basically have people sort of expand and collapse the navigation pieces, and you can support a much larger navigation while getting users focused on the content first.
So for example, that could involve things like, say, a table of contents.
Exactly. So the next piece is looking not just at the home page, but within the OT, there's the set of tasks. So the original demo just lists out a list of tasks. Well, we can basically turn that into a grid, and rather than just having text, why don't we just add an icon and make it clear for users to understand what's going on. And again, having some intro text just makes it a little easier for people to understand what's happening, and you can reuse these chunks. So again, in the DITA pattern, the task list itself is all based on the actual tasks. You're using teasers, titles, images associated with a piece of content. So this page could just be built dynamically. And then when you get down to the desktop size, we've now gone from a 3-column to a 2-column to a 1-column layout, and it's really easy to get an overview of everything that's going on, and it's much more usable at all screen sizes than just having a list of content. And then we get into an actual task. So again, we've basically reusing all the content. We've got title, image, and the teaser that was basically part of the link on the previous page. And now we've basically got a call to action, and then there's the steps. And just to make a bit more of an interesting example, I've also added a required items list. You could add other types of structured content, things that'll just make it easier for users to complete their tasks. So now we've basically moved the topic underneath, with the assumption that it's not as important as the task you're actually interested in. It can come after. It shows you what's related. It shows you where things belong, what other related concepts there are. And as you get to the small screen size, everything's sort of put in a 1-column list, and you've got your list of required items, and then you've got your list of steps. It's a really easy pattern. It's really easy for users to understand everything and what they need to do to work through the task at hand. And let's just go in the small size. You can then, in the mobile navigation, you can also start sort of showing related tasks as children. You could have the navigation menu expand. You could make it an accordion style menu and allow people to drill through that main navigation menu. For simplicity's sake, we've just sort of showing parents and siblings at this point. But there's not just one way of showing, one pattern to use for everything. So along with the tasks, there's also the concepts, and we could have followed the same pattern as we did in the task list. Just have a grid of all of the concepts with their title and a short description, and then link to a separate page to handle the detailed descriptions. But it's a case that I think we could do better than that. In most cases, if you look at the content for these concepts, they're short stubs of content. They don't necessarily warrant a full page on their own. And they're nice little chunks of structured content, so we can just pull them into an accordion menu. People can then sort of scroll through, see all of the concepts at one point. There's the related information box that shows related content, related concepts, but also links to tasks that are related. So you're already sort of making connections between structured content in different places. And this pattern also works really well on sort of tablet and mobile size. So we've now got the related box underneath the main content for a piece, and this just lets you as a user sort of go through, find all the pieces of content you're looking for, and basically not have to worry about navigating back and forth to sort of see little chunks of content. One of the things that everyone will run into is tables, and I just wanted to show a demo of how responsive tables actually work, and two example patterns on how you can deal with responsive tables. And dealing with responsive tables is a question of A, the technical approach, and B, whether or not you want content authors to set priority, or if you want this to just be a create the tables and then just have an automated approach. So as we get smaller, our unresponsive table still works, it still fits, but then when we get to our small screen, and you can't sort of see, but it's cut off. There's 3 columns. You can't get to it because in many cases having an off-canvas pattern means you can't zoom and pinch the screen. So a user's stuck in a position where they can't actually see the content. Here's a simple pattern that basically takes the first column and just locks it to the left side and then allows users to scroll. So you've got your list of perks here, and then you've got all the other information relating to it. This is a great pattern as long as your first column is the most important one. If it's not, then you're sort of locking an unrelated piece of content that doesn't need to be sort of positioned where it is. And then another approach is this interactive table where you've got basically, it's now 3 columns that are mid-size. We're at 6 columns, and at full desktop we're at 9 columns. The one piece here is that users can select which ones they want to see. As it's at full desktop size, users will see everything. But at small screen, this allows me to decide, okay, I'm interested in trade time and open. So now I can't see everything at once, but I can scroll. So I might decide that trade time and last trade aren't as interesting. So now I've got the tailored information I need. In this scenario, the content author needs to define which the most important tables columns are, but it doesn't hide content from mobile users because of a content author's assumption. Users can always get to the information they're actually looking for. So that covers our demo, and I hope it sort of shows that responsive and DITA can be used to create user-centered experiences across devices using the power of structured content, and at the same time using a responsive approach that allows you to tailor that experience across devices.
So please talk to us in order to get the best out of both worlds. And at this point, well, we turn things over to you. We'd like to hear if there's any questions you may have for us on what we presented.
Well, thank you, Keith and Phil. This has definitely been a very informative webinar indeed. The first question that has come in is responsive or adaptive? Would they be the same?
This is where you can get into technicalities. Adaptive, by pure definition, is a similar approach, but rather than fluid, you set specific breakpoints. That's the technical difference. They're slightly different flavors on the same approach. The advantage to responsive is you basically, you both use breakpoints, both use basically the same techniques. In adaptive, rather than sort of having the screen flexible, the content adapt flexibly between the different sizes, it basically just sets a screen, a design for 760 pixel width, and then at 1200 it just jumps. There's no fluidity between the sizes. The advantage to that is that it works as a pattern. The one advantage to responsive is that because it's fluid, you have a bit of a better experience in the intermediate sizes. So if a new tablet class comes in that is right in between the sort of the classic 768 and the 320, responsive covers that already, whereas in an adaptive scenario you'd have space on either side of the content.
All right. Thank you so much for that. The next question that's come in is, were you using a plugin to show the different screen sizes on the demo?
I was. That's a small JavaScript bookmarklet called, I think, resize.js.
Okay, thank you. And the next question that's come in is, how do you know where to put the information for a technical document in the responsive web design?
Well, part of that answer is you have to know. I mean, I'm going to hedge my bets about this. There is no firm answer to saying it will always be this way or that way. But you have to base whatever how you design the information depending on who you're aiming this at and the types of scenarios in which you're likely to be using it. So responsive web design could be used for very long electrical engineering documents, but it's probably better aimed, and perhaps electrical engineers who are looking for specific bits of information while they're on the go. And in fact, one of the studies I did some time ago suggested that electrical engineers who were looking for information while in, say, something like a clean room environment, were taking their cell phones and in some cases their tablets into the clean rooms, and we're actually actively accessing content, on the go, right there on the spot. In a clean room environment, instead of going outside, finding the information on a desktop machine, perhaps printing it out on a special dustless printer, and then having to go through the whole clean room process to get back in and then do the work. It's just so much easier and faster. So knowing that, it's a matter of customizing the right types of docs to the right types of scenarios and the ways that the users are likely to use it. So, is there a hard and fast rule about this? No, of course it can't be. But again, where it makes sense to do so, where it makes sense to present information in an area where it's likely to be used in a mobile environment, and as we've seen, more often than not, that's just about everything these days. It makes sense to try to strip things down to its essentials, which DITA and minimalism tries to do, and again, put that wherever possible in a responsive web design framework.
Thank you. The next question is, what happens when a new device is released that becomes popular? How do you design to include that new device?
From a responsive standpoint, the advantage is that you're really just going by screen or by browser width and height. So what happens is, and the Google Glass example was a great one, that we weren't sure what that would actually look like. And then when you start using it, you realize that basically responsive only cares about the height and width of the browser. It's a 640 by, I think it was 640 by 480 screen. Therefore, it basically followed the 640 by 480 pattern. Because our lowest cutoff point was 768 for the medium tablet size. Anything that's below 768 just has the mobile pattern. If you find out that there's, say, a new intermediate size that sort of has an odd dimensions, say there's a new incredibly popular refrigerator screen and you're designing a recipe site and your site doesn't work, you could just add in a new breakpoint and set a whole, and basically redefine some of the layout based on CSS for an intermediate point. And it could be height. So say it's a really high, skinny recipe or screen type. You could then basically, based on the screen dimensions, rejig the layout and the priorities to better suit that device. In a scenario where it's not it won't break anything if a new device comes in. It just means that you might have to do some tweaking, or they'll fall back to an existing sort of layout pattern.
Thank you, Phil. The next question is, why not just make an app for your content?
You can. Apps are fabulous. The question with apps really boils down to a couple of factors. Price. You've got to design, build, maintain an app. It has to be in the App Store. You need a different set of skills to develop an app. And in many cases, there's sort of the pre-built app sort of creators that you can just use their sort of standard app and plug your content in. And that's like any sort of plug and play thing. It won't be quite sort of tailored to your users' needs. But the biggest barrier, one of the biggest factors I like to consider is how committed are your users to using your content? Is it the type of relationship where they go in and look at it 7, 8, 9 times a day? In that case, having an app that they've downloaded that has the content there might make sense. If it's a scenario where people go once, twice a month and use the content, a web platform is more efficient because they don't have to commit to downloading it. They might not. And then there's the advantage to responsive is that it's browser-based. So you're not worrying about what OS, which Android version am I supporting? What flavor of Android do I need to worry about a new device? But it's really a case of looking at the case for your content and your users and your current situation to really make the decision on whether apps are feasible and worth it. And also if you need any of the sort of additional functionality. Do you need access to the camera? In that case, having apps is pretty much the way you need to go.
Thank you, Phil. The next question that's come in is, how would you output data using a responsive web design template?
Well, what I think would be done here is essentially that once the a responsive web design template is created and crafted using good IA principles, as we've been saying, what you then do is that you essentially would insert that into the standard output, the output path for producing customized HTML content. So within something like the DITA-OT or any other output process you may be using by, Antenna House, RenderX, whatever, you would then have an option that would essentially allow you to insert into the process, output this process within the existing responsive web design template. And you will find that there's not actually a whole lot of tweaking that needs to be done. The chief thing is first is doing the IA work on the actual responsive web design template, and then throwing the content into it on a production basis. And one of the nice things about this, again, where responsive web design beats out things like, say, apps, is that you can do iterations very quickly because you just throw this into the standard output process. You're basically publishing the content within this framework instead of having to go in and relaunch an app? I'm not even sure how that's done. I don't know how that's done, Phil. How would you relaunch an app?
Well, depending how you've built it, you might actually just have sort of a content download, but it would mean either having people download the entire app again, or having users download all of the content whenever it's updated, whether they need to or are using it or not.
Exactly. So again, in this case, because you're actually accessing the web directly, much less hassle in this case.
Thank you, Keith. This question just came in is, can I leverage responsive web design in EPUB 3 transforms?
And I can't answer that one. Any guesses on that, Phil?
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. But leave that with us, and we will look into it.
At first glance, I'm thinking that I don't think it's impossible, but it would take a bit of tweaking. It may not necessarily be EPUB 3. It may not be. Well, I don't know. It probably could be outputted to EPUB 3, but then you're limited to the restrictions on formatting within that particular format. If you do it as pure responsive web design in HTML, then there's no issues. But I think theoretically there's other than whatever restrictions are actually native to that EPUB format, I don't see offhand why that ought to be a real restriction. So my guess is maybe.
Okay, thank you, Keith. The last question that has come in is, can you show us any real-world examples of DITA and responsive web design?
Oh, okay. There are several examples on the DITA Writer site, and if you actually do a search on sample or samples, you actually run across a page called sample DITA produce output. And now, while they're not all responsive web design, the two that I know of offhand, which are, include the Oxygen manual. So anybody who's familiar with the Oxygen XML manual, they actually have a responsive web design version of that, which is actually pretty good. And there's also, I'm also familiar with Ixtisoft's version, and they've also gone to a responsive web design format. If you want to check out their particular online docs and then change the browser width side, you can see how, what patterns that they've decided to adopt for their own particular DITA content. So yes, there are some real-world examples out there. The examples that we showed earlier, we wanted to make sure that, here are some things that we think that just about everybody ought to be familiar with, and can also be able to play with online.
Well, thank you, Keith. Definitely appreciate that. That is all the questions that we received. So I'd like to say thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Keith and Phil, for this informative webinar. This concludes today's broadcast. You can access the recorded version of this webinar in the webinar archive section of our website, which is at www.dclab.com. Our next webinar will be next Wednesday, June 18th at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, titled Case Study, The Value of Partnership During Conversion, which is being presented by Nikki Davis, PhD. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and have a great day.
And actually, before we go, we just want to get to, if you want to get in touch with us, and if you just go to the next slide, there's our email addresses. So for Phil, it's phil@yellowpencil.com. And for myself, it's keith@yellowpencil.com. And please check out our Twitter accounts and join us at yellowpencil.com.
Great. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.